Hey guys, Alan here, Solid Rock Class. Hey, 2 weeks ago we talked about worldviews versus God's views. And I think that's so important as we step back into the thought pattern that we're going to be in for a while here, which is back to character traits of Jesus. We went through character traits of Jesus, and we're going to go back through those, but we're going to be using different scriptures. We're going to be using kind of a different thought patterns on a lot of them. And so I hope you stay with me on these. But last week we talked about being fearless. Today we're going to be talking about contentment. Contentment within our Christian life. We pick up in 1 Timothy, the 6th chapter, in verse number 6. It says, "But godliness with contentment is great gain." Notice godliness and contentment are put together. Godliness with contentment. He said it's great gain to us. So what is this contentment thought pattern? It's understanding and accepting that God has provided everything we need for adjusting to circumstances around us. So contentment, it's not a destination. Contentment is a way that we make this journey happen, that we live in contentment as God changes things. And we look in Proverbs, the 19th chapter, verse 23, and he says, "The fear of the Lord tendeth to life, and he that hath it shall abide satisfied. He shall not be visited with evil." Hey, I want to pop a different version here just real quick on this. English Standard Version, which is a version I like to kind of migrate over to occasionally. And I think it says this verse extremely well. It says, "The fear of the Lord leads to life, and whosoever has it rests satisfied. He will not be visited by harm." Paul said it like this. We kick back into something else Paul said here in Philippians, the 4th chapter, verse 11. "Not that I speak in respect of want." Notice he says, I am not talking about something I want here. He says, "For what I've learned, whatsoever state I am, therewith to be content." Where God puts us and the circumstances God has us in, Paul says, that is the state we need to be in. We need to be in this state of contentment. You see, let's talk about Paul for a minute. Paul, as he's writing this, he's in prison. He's in a Roman jail. He's got Roman guards on each side of him. He knows that he's basically has the death penalty. He knows he's not going to come out of this alive. That's a lot of stress, isn't it? Can you imagine being on death row at San Quentin or death row anywhere, knowing that you was about to be executed? They was about to give you a lethal injection, or they was going to give you gas, or they was going to cut your head off. And Paul's writing this under that type of knowledge. Paul's writing this, and as he's writing this, realize something. He's one who's had this kind of a golden or a silver spoon in his mouth all his life. Yet, during ministry, he definitely knew what poverty was, didn't he? Paul knew what it was to live under persecution, but he also knew what it was like to live in peace. Paul knew what it was like to have a roof over his head, and he knew what it was like to have to sleep outside with the stars above him. Paul knew what it was to take and have a full stomach and have a good meal, but he also knew what it was like to go hungry. Paul many times was surrounded by loving, caring Christians. Yet, guess what? There were times that Paul felt absolutely abandoned by his Christian brothers. I know I've felt that in the past, and I know that you've felt that in the past. Paul knew what it was to take and to be healthy and to thrive. But also the Bible takes and it talks about Paul as having a thorn in the flesh, and God refused to take it away. Yet notice that Paul was content with it. He was okay with it. He said it kept him humble. Where we're headed here is actually Matthew, the 26th chapter. And Matthew, the 26th chapter is Jesus here. This is his final days. Jesus is, he's just experienced what we call Palm Sunday, where he's had that triumphal entry. Now we see that there is a plot against him to kill him. Judas is all set up to take and to betray him at this particular point. Now we see that he's taken, and with his disciples, he's had the Passover supper. He's also had what we call the Lord's Supper. He's went through the washing of the saints' feet, or the washing of the disciples' feet here. He knows what's going to happen. Remember, Jesus is God, but he's also man. He has perfect knowledge of everything that's happening. Yet he has all the emotions and the feelings that we have. In fact, the Bible says he has all of that, yet he still sinned not. You and I, when we have knowledge of something that's about to happen, something disastrous, and we can see it coming down the tracks. We see the light at the end of the tunnel and we think it's probably a train. You know what I'm talking about? Well, Jesus knew that, only he had perfect knowledge. He knew what was coming for sure. So in Matthew, the 26th chapter, picking up in verse 36, we see that he picks out his most trusted disciples to go with him to pray. In Matthew, let's pick it up in verse 36. It says, "Then cometh Jesus with them to a place called Gethsemane, and said unto the disciples, Set ye here while I go and pray yonder." Notice he says, stay right here. Then notice what he does in verse 37. He says, "And he took with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, and began to be sorrowful and very heavy." Notice the emotion Jesus has here. Notice the burden that Jesus has here. Then we look at verse 38, and it says, "Then said he unto them, My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even unto death. Tarry ye here, watch with me." So he left him there, and in verse 39 it says, "And he went a little further, and he fell on his face, and he prayed, saying, O Father, if this be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done." Notice Jesus was okay with the Father's decision. He was content with it. He didn't want it. He was feeling all the emotions of all the negative in the human side. But notice he said, "Not my will, but thine be done." That's if we have a big takeaway here, that's the takeaway. In verse 40 it says, "And he cometh unto his disciples, and findeth them asleep, and said unto Peter, What, could I not watch with me 1 hour? And then he goes on in verse 41, it says, "Watch and pray." He has these extremely close friends. They're not standing up with him here. They're going to abandon him. And we know Peter's going to deny him soon. In verse 41, he says, "Watch and pray that ye enter not into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." Verse 42, "He went away again the second time, and he prayed, saying, O Father, if this cup may not pass away from me, except I drink it, thy will be done." That's contentment we're talking about. Jesus, he is our example, and he's showing us that we need to be content with God's direction, with the circumstances God has us in right now, that we need to be content with those. In verse 43, "And he came and found them asleep again, for their eyes were very heavy." Can you imagine the emotion Jesus has here when he comes back the second time and he finds them asleep? They're not standing with him. They're not taking this serious. You know, you and I, when we come across situations, we take things serious when it's personal like this. And this is his own life. He left them again. In verse 45, I'll jump down to, then cometh he to his disciples and saith unto them, sleep on. So he leaves them in verse 44, which I overlooked. He left them, went away again. He prayed the same prayer the third time, saying the same words. He comes back and they're asleep again. He says, sleep on now. He's accepted the fact that he's going to have to go through this alone. He's content with this fact. You know, there's times God takes away friends. Sometimes God takes away people that we rely on. Sometimes God takes away people that are friends of ours. Well, one thing I've learned is when God takes something away, he gives something back a whole lot better. I know he's done that in my life. I know he's done that in your life. Maybe that person was some sort of a crutch that you don't need to rely on anymore. Maybe that person was just there until you came to a certain maturity. In verse 44, he says, and he left them and went away again. I'm sorry, I backtracked here. Verse 46, he says, rise, let us be going. Behold, he is at hand that doth betray me. He knows that Judas is right there to betray him. So notice Jesus is content with God's will. Also, he notices that people that he thought was going to be loyal to him betrayed him. Judas sold him out. Peter took and denied him just a little bit later. His closest disciples, they didn't watch and pray with him like he asked for. He asked for them to hold him up, to help him get through this emotional time. They weren't there. They weren't serious. They weren't engaged. So, it's not taking in, as we look at contentment, it's not settling for where we're at. Contentment's, again, the way that we travel the journey. It doesn't mean we shouldn't be striving for promotion. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't be attempting to some way increase the way that we live and the way our family lives. Contentment is being satisfied where God has you today, right now. Paul didn't want to go to jail. Paul didn't want to die. But he was content where God had him at the moment. Jesus, he didn't want to go to the cross. But he was at peace and he was content with what God's will was. So the big lesson is be content as we travel this life's journey. Be content where God has us today. And if we're content where God has us today, we go back to 1 Timothy, the 6th chapter, verse 6. But godliness with contentment is great gain. Hey, this is Alan. I'll catch up with you just a little bit later.